Members, thank you for attending. Council has yet to be in session, but this subcommittee on the long-term housing strategy has started working. I'd like to invite the administration to come in. Item number 1, long-term housing strategy consultation document. You see it in front of you. It's paper CB bracket 11756/12 bracket 01. Administration's constitution document on long-term housing strategy, building consensus, building homes. Welcome, Secretary. CB bracket 11818/12 bracket 01, Administration's paper on long-term housing strategy consultation paper. In the third document, IN 27/12-13, information note on long-term housing strategy prepared by the Research Office of the Legislative Council Secretariat. I take the opportunity to thank the Research Office of the Secretariat for their hard work. Let me welcome Secretary for Transport and Housing, Professor Anthony Cheung, Permanent Secretary for Transport and Housing, Mr. Pescott, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Housing, Ms. Agnes Wong, and Senior Economist, Mr. Ho, and from the Housing Department, Strategic Planning, Mr. Leung. This is the first discussion in the LegCo on the consultation paper of the long-term housing strategy. I'd like to leave more time for members to express their views. For the first round, members will have 5 minutes. In relation to this consultation paper, the subcommittee will hold a public hearing, which is open to all members of the public who are interested. They can come to express their views. Secretary, please liaise with us about available dates for holding this public consultation, because this is very important. Secretary, would you take us through the paper? Mr. Chairman, on the 3rd of September, we announced the consultation paper. Immediately afterwards, copies were sent to legislators. The consultation period started in September. It's been about 4 weeks. We've just held the first district forum. Today, we are in the subcommittee to listen to the views from members on the consultation paper. This paper is compiled by the Long-Term Housing Strategy Steering Committee for short. They've had in-depth discussions before coming up with this consultation paper. During the consultation period, views will be collected, and such views will be collated. The steering committee will give recommendation to the administration, which will then formulate their housing policies. The theme of the consultation paper is building consensus, building homes. It has set out the aspiration of people wanting to have their own home. It has mentioned about the different housing supplies through public and subsidized housing to help those who are in need, and also to provide housing for those who are in need of public housing. In relation to the steering committee, the role will be strengthened and to address the imbalance of demand and supply. In this relation, the initial proposal will be for public and private housing to be on the ratio of 60 to 40. The number of targets proposed will be more than the amount of the new HOS. In the coming 10 years, the total housing supply will range from 440,000 to 500,000 units, with a proposed supply target of 470,000 units. Whether this is sufficient is one of the points to be discussed in the consultation. The principle of the steering committee is not to over or underestimate demand and supply. This target and proposed range is based on detailed discussion and analysis. We've taken into account the current projection of total housing supply in the next 10 years, taking into account the need of those who are inadequately housed and the number of people in transitional housing, and also students who might come from the mainland to Hong Kong to study. We also have taken into account the number of vacant flats. And then we work out the total supply target. And this is only in relation to quantity. So in relation to moving from renting to purchase or to move up on the housing ladder, these are not taken into account. The estimate will be reviewed and updated every year to reflect the latest information of the housing market and the general economic situation. We know that in the short term, supply of housing will not be able to meet demand. We take into account the different needs of different sectors, and we will prioritize them. We identify that those in grassroots families and elderly people are in the greatest need of help from us. PRH will aim at providing housing for low-income elderly and low-income families. We will also take into account the average waiting time, that is the first allocation of 3 years for PRH. The steering committee will ensure that public resources will be used in an optimal and fair way. In relation to non-elderly singleton, through improvement of the quota and points system, we will reduce the waiting time for applicants over the age of 35. The steering committee is of the view that when it comes to the middle class and also younger generations, we need to improve the housing ladder and to increase the supply of HOS flats for our youngsters. In relation to subdivided flats, the committee's view is that all housing should be safe. And there are views asking for a licensing or registration system. I'd like to reiterate that all illegal subdivided flats and partition flats will have to be phased out, and we will do so, and we'll also step up our enforcement efforts. In relation to subdivided flats in mixed housing or residential housing, well, some people think that this will that will be an impact on people living in subdivided units. If there are regulations, it will push up the cost of such flats. But there are views that if we can better regulate the safety and hygiene of subdivided flats, this will improve the living environment of the grassroots people. In relation to whether the supply target will be achieved, currently the administration has identified sufficient housing supply to provide 179,000 units between 2012, 13 and 2021 and 22, and to supply a total of 170,000 HOS flats and 5,000 flats every year. If all are provided, we reckon that on average we'll be able to provide, the market will be able to provide us housing land for 20,000 units in the private market. But we have to continue to identify land for the construction of 70,000 housing units. So the administration will have to continue to review all land policies and to adopt a multi-pronged approach to release potential land, say for example to change land use and to increase development density of residential land, and also reviewing urban redevelopment. Yes, indeed. Increasing the supply of land is a great challenge. Different stakeholders very often have different views and stance. So there is a need for the community to forge consensus and to make important choices. What's most important is that between land development and sustainable development, they are compatible and they can coexist. And future new towns should be developed as a self-sustained in an integrated manner to reduce cross-district transportation load. That's all for now. I'd like to hear from members. Thank you, Secretary. Before I open the floor to members, I'd like to ask the Secretary about your progress. You will collect views over 3 months. When will you be able to submit the report to the administration? And when will the administration come up with a conclusion? I asked you these questions because this subcommittee needs to follow up on the review of the long-term housing strategy all the way till the end. Well, I have two hats. One is the chairman of the steering committee. The other one is the bureau secretary. In terms of the steering committee, when the consultation period ends on the 2nd of December, we will lose no time to collate all the views and compile our consultation report to the administration. Members of the steering committee expressed the wish to complete the work as soon as possible. I believe that in 2014, beginning of the year, the work will be completed. Of course, it is subject to the amount of views and received and its complexity. But the steering committee has expressed that they will complement the administration's work as soon as possible. Housing is of prime concern, and it is a great challenge. I am a chairman of the steering committee. As I said, that we do not want to lose any time. At the beginning of 2014, we think the consultation report will be submitted to the administration. Hopefully, the administration will lose no time to come up with proposed a policy. The relevant departments and officials will continue to listen to the views of the public. I asked this question because the term of this subcommittee lasts only for 1 year only. If necessary, I will have to make an application to the House Committee for an extension. We've already started. I don't want to not see it till the end. if the administration said that they would make good use of the time available, and they will be able to come up with a conclusion at the beginning of next year, I think there is a need for me to make an application to the House Committee for an extension. Members, you may also express your views on this. We are now making arrangements with the administration for the public hearing. I'm afraid we may need more than one session. Now I open the floor for members to speak and ask questions. Later we will talk about how we're going to proceed with the work of the subcommittee. We have Kwok-hing, Frederick Fung, Wu Chi-wai, Leung Chi-chung, Alice Mak, Kwok-hing, Fernanda Chung, Kwok-hing. First round, 5 minutes each.
Mr. Kwok-hing. Thank you, Chairman. The Secretary had talked about the document for a long time, and it's finally available. But looking at the figures, I think the public is very concerned. The figures you quoted are every year on average 47,000. That is HOS plus PRH. We have 28,000 and 18,000 respectively. So I think these are ridiculous figures. In the last term of government, private housing, before Zhang Yamkun left, before Donald Tsang left, it was 20,000 per year, and now you have not increased it. It has even fallen to 18,000. So the speculators, on one hand, you're repressing it through special stamp duty, but they are quietly happy, because this will indicate that home prices will only go up. The second ridiculous issue is that the supply of PRH. The Secretary said that you would target the grassroots, but those on the waiting list, these are the lowest income groups. We have 116,000 applicants and non-single elderly, and their average three-person family income is 11,000. So you're just playing games with figures. You're saying they can be housed in 3 years, but in this term of government, on average, per year, there are 16,000 houses PRH being built. So for these people, these 110,000, it will take them 7 years to be housed, and that does not include the ones you ignore. That is the non-elderly singletons. And in fact, they are homeless. You say that you want to deal with subdivided units. There are some 170,000 people in subdivided units. So if you want to house them, it would take 4 or 5 years. So these figures indicate that the government is impotent. You also said that even the figure of 40,000 you quoted, they can't be housed because you don't have the land. So people in subdivided, in industrial buildings, in subdivided units, it takes about 15 years before they can be housed. So what you're telling the Hong Kong public, it's just irresponsible lies. Chairman, Mr. Kwok raised a few questions. First of all, we need to look at our starting point. In fact, we are facing a long waiting list, whether it is the regular waiting list or for the non-elderly singletons. In the waiting list, we have a first priority performance indicators, and some can be housed in 3 years or less, or some are more. That would involve different factors such as location. So we could provide information at a later stage. The reality is that even if we have new land to build, it takes time, it takes planning. So in the coming few years, there won't be much change in the figures. And in the next 5 years, it would be 79,000 units and some other HOS. Now, according to LTHS forecasts, the demand of 47, or the supply of 47,000 is a reasonable goal. To satisfy the goal, it's very challenging, but we hope that that can be achieved. In the coming years, the PRH supply if you compare to the last few years, it has increased. Even and that would also apply to private housing. So the extra 47,000 supply, it will be a 60-40 supply ratio. So will that affect private sector? Well, we've calculated a figure of 20,000. This is not a holy figure. It's just a performance indicator. So we have to, as I said in the beginning, the total figures have to be reviewed on a yearly basis. Regarding private housing, of course, the government, we want to stabilize the property market. We don't want volatility. So the 60-40 ratio is a balance. So why do we emphasize public housing? Chairman, a lot of families can't afford. I have a short question. We have 220,000 people on the waiting list. Can you tell us how long will it take to clear this backlog for the people who are waiting in 2013? When will they get housing? Chairman, our waiting list, as I said just now, we have two sides. We have regular applicants, the family households, and then we have the non-elderly singletons. The target now for regular applicants, we want to maintain it on average for the first choice, it would be 3 years. The 470,000 then public housing would make up some 280,000. This is new housing. So 10 years. Please allow me to finish. And every year in our resumed housing, there are some 7,000 units. So whether it is public or private, to satisfy this demand, then if the total demand is stable, and if it is a reasonable assessment, then in the coming 10 years, then according to our building speed, our land supply speed, it could be satisfied. But if you want to solve it immediately in the coming few years, then it's not likely. Okay, next we have Mr. Fong Kim Gate. I need to challenge the Secretary's paper and his methodology. First of all, I would like you to refer to our Secretariat research paper. It's a high quality paper. Your 470,000 is underestimate. In the last LTHS under Mr. Tong Chi-hwa, the figure was 850,000, and the popular figures, the population at that time was about 6.5 million. We now have more than 7 million people in Hong Kong, and the average waiting time was 3.6 years. So if you look at the household, number of family members in the household and so on, that also went up. So if you look at the figures, it's impossible. In the past, we had a smaller population, and we had less people in a household. Now we have a larger population and more family members in a household. In the past, we needed 850,000, and now you are assessing some 470,000. So, are you trying to say that Mr. Tong Chi-hwa's figures were incorrect and your current figures are correct? Otherwise, you can't change the target from some 800,000 to 470,000. Do you also have the Secretariat paper? I assume you do have it. So in paragraph 2.20, this seems to be the opposite of what the UK Institute of Public Policy Research have found. It says that when the economy turns down, there's a bigger need for government housing. But now Hong Kong economy is doing quite well, but we have more people needing government housing. So if you were to adopt that study methodology, we now are in an economic upturn, and we need more government housing. So your 60-40 ratio, is that appropriate? Of course. We need to talk about total figures. I'm not saying you need to reduce private housing. There is a basis for private housing, So is your assessment for public housing an underestimate? The third area I want to challenge is urban renewal. 40 public housing estates that are older than 40 years should be part of the urban renewal program. So we had provided you with a suggestion. You can, if you rebuild these, you can double the supply of housing. The old areas, including Kowloon City and Samsoipo, along the flight routes, these can be redeveloped. We can develop a new community. And why don't you investigate that area? And another area I want to challenge is the steering committee. It's not a government body. It's and after they provided a document, they will come up with a conclusion, and that has to be provided to the government again. So that is different from the previous long-term housing subcommittees. We had one commissioned by Mr. Tong Chi-hua, and the previous one was commissioned by MacLehose. And now, even after consultation, there is no conclusion. Are you postponing again and again? So could you respond to my challenges? Mr. Fung actually raised 4 challenges, so I would need some extra time. On his 4th question, what is the steering committee? It assisted in drafting this paper, this consultation paper, and it will also draft the report. And then the government will make a formal decision. So the government won't change the long-term housing strategy. We are not having a dialogue here. Since you raised questions, would you allow the Secretary to respond? If you're unsatisfied with one round, you can queue in the second round. This is a consultation paper, so the views collected in the 3 months are important, and the government will need to listen to the public's views and then make a decision. For urban renewal, the paper says that this is a method of increasing supply. So including old public housing estates, these will be rebuilt. But we don't have a timetable, a specific timetable for urban renewal. So in our update and review, we will take into account these new developments. What we now have is a total assessment, and it comes to some 470,000, but it's not set in stone. So when the economy turns down, if you look at the demand, I think the demand is there whether we have economic uptick or downturn. So some 10 odd years ago, after the Asian financial crisis, the property prices fell and people didn't buy. So if you want to talk about demand, it really depends on the circumstances. Just now, Mr. Fung, you mentioned the research paper by the Council Secretariat, where they looked at the Institute of Public Policy Research. I have that information. But if you look around the world, and there is different methodology used. Of course, in Hong Kong, we're using a different method compared to 98 because the circumstances are different. We also want to implement the best policy, and we have to take into account the different household structure, housing quality, and so on. So I think we've included the most important factors. Whether we have underestimated or not, why in 98 we had figures of 85,000 and 850,000 over 10 years. We will not comment on that now, but if you look at the figures of new households in the long-term housing strategy issued in 98, and if you look at the situation now, if you look at the increase in households compiled by Census and Statistics, it's not as much as 85,000.
Remember first, the exercise that comes up with the numbers will be reviewed every year. So we can take into account the economic changes as they take place. That's one of the key recommendations set out in the report, because we recognize the economic implications. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that when the projection was calculated previously, those circumstances were very different to today. For example, as the member probably is aware, the reason that the previous chief executive, Mr. Tung, said we want to reduce the waiting time to 3 years is at that time it was over 7 years. So we have successfully reduced the waiting time, clearly, by putting up a lot more units into the market. That has to be reflected in the current projection. So there are very different circumstances between today's projection and what happened over 10 years ago.
Next, Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Thank you. Well, whether there is any underestimation of supply, well, there has been a lot of comments, and I'm not going to make one. Well, assuming that the supply estimate is reasonable, there is still one thing that I would challenge you. The ratio of 60-40, does it cover the need as set out in the paper? It talks about household income with under $40,000 can be housed through PRH or subsidized housing, depending on the actual income. Of course, if you earn, say, for example, over $35,000, you may be housed in the private market. Given Hong Kong's current income level, about 70% of the households make under $40,000. As a result, the ratio of 60-40 will affect the effectiveness of provision of adequate housing to those in need, as set out in the paper. It says in the paper that the administration will provide steady land supply for private housing, so that people with the means will be able to buy their flat in the private market. And if we use $40,000 as the benchmark, using half of the income towards mortgage payment, the value of the flat to be purchased will be under $4 million. In the market, the new supply, is it sufficient for the relevant group? It doesn't seem to be the case. For those who need public housing, say for example HOS, the number is not small. Will the administration make a clearer commitment? Currently, they say they will provide 60% of the housing. Well, you may not be able to cover the target group as set out in the paper. Of course, they're subject to a number of other factors, say, for example, land supply and economic situation. We often see two sets of figures for public housing. 1.15 million units. And it says that 1.09 million households are living in public housing. And out of them, there are quite a number of them who are in transitional housing. So what problems do these figures show? We're talking about two sets of figures. How do you explain about this phenomenon? how can you make effective use of the 50,000 public housing that are currently vacant? Well, there are a number of questions there. I hope I will have some time. Please be precise. I ask members to save some more time for the administration, for the secretary to reply. I will not be stringent, but if everyone overruns, then those that comes later will not have a full 5 minutes. In relation to public housing, vacancy rate. Well, there aren't as many as tens of thousands, and I will give you more figures shortly. And I will, since there are quite a number of speculations on the number of vacant flats, I will give more information later. In relation to the ratio of 60-40, this is only a tentative and initial ratio proposed. In the Hong Kong Island District Forum, some people suggested 70-30. And some legislators said that because there is a small number in the private market, it would then push up prices. The main message is that there will be more public housing units than private ones. We see that given the current rental level and price level, a lot of families can't afford to buy their own home. We do think that the steering committee has an important role to play when it comes to provision of housing. The public housing supply will increase, but as to how much, we will continue to listen to views. For those who are not eligible for PRH units, they will still encounter difficulties in purchasing their own flats, and they form a very important part in the housing ladder. Mr. Pascal or Ms. Wong? Vacancy rate of PRH units. You have to bear in mind that it is on the basis of units. According to the administrative record as at 30th of June, for vacant units for rental, it amounts to 3,689. Number of people in the household, as we've mentioned, we used a figure from the Census and Statistics Department, which we all know is only a sample and is not for the purpose of calculating vacancy rates. Let me give an example. Say, for example, in PRH unit, maybe one household is using 2 units. It may be a big household, and we're talking about over 5,000 of such households. And when the CNS department was conducting the survey, they were doing it for a different purpose. So they excluded a transient population. Say, for example, Hong Kong mainland truck drivers. They are treated as transient population, so they're excluded. But in our survey, they are included as our tenants. So we're talking about 2 completely different bases. So the number of households is not a way to calculate vacancy rates. But I'd like to talk about this. The inclusion of subsidized housing as well, not just a PRH. Mr. Leung Chi-chiang. Secretary, this has always been my view of the long-term housing strategy. You should formulate policies that are confined to your own term, because the next government may not use the same policy. In relation to the figures in the consultation document, I've made my own calculations and there are discrepancies. There's a net increase plus number of applicants on the waiting list of PRH and a small number of urban renewal. I've done my calculations, the figure is slightly smaller. Well, I don't object to your setting the figure a little bit higher, but when it comes to the net increase, I would like to know whether you base your calculation on the number of potential immigrants plus newborn babies in Hong Kong. Well, let me go through all my questions first. If that is the case, of course, there are voices in the community asking for a revision of our immigration policy. So that may be outside the purview of the steering committee. But you also need to take into account a population policy and then make amendments to make your estimates and figures more accurate. While I was listening intently when the Secretary was giving his opening speech, he mentioned about private housing and public housing. That it is difficult to find land. You encounter a lot of resistance in the community. People are of the impression that you're over the top. In Yuen Long, there are 5 Hung Shui Kiu, Yuen Long South, Pa Hang South, Long Ping, and West Rail, the superstructure of railway stations. 10 years later, all of these will start take in. Will you not be able to absorb them all? Secretary, will you have a discussion with the district in a comprehensive way? Secretary, you should not mind just people under you should not mind their own turf. I know that there is the housing department in Hung Shui Kiu and someone else somewhere in another area. It's very bizarre. Secretary, your third point, to garner support from the community. Of course, when it comes to specific housing projects, it is the housing authority, housing department who does that. When it comes to Hung Shui Kiu, say for example, new development areas, it's under the purview of the Development Bureau, but we maintain close liaison. When I had a meeting with deputy chairman and chairman of district councils, I heard their voices that we should provide comprehensive information to them to facilitate discussion. When there is an increase of population, of course, we will take into account the capacity of the district in terms of housing and transportation. In relation to future demand projection, we look at the increase of new households. Say, for example, people are starting their own families, households are breaking down into nuclear families. And we take into account different scenarios in working out the estimate. And of course, in our projection, we have included immigrants. There may be other factors in play affecting the actual number in the future. So we have worked out the estimate, and still we will revise the estimate every year, taking into account the latest situation. Of course, we don't want to over or underestimate the number. But when it comes to planning, whether it's housing or not, it's the same. It takes time for it to materialize, and there will be changes of government. I believe that if the community has consensus on a development goal and housing policies, and the next government will continue with what we've started. Alice Mark. The last point. Yes, well, decisions of one government will affect the situation for the next government. To a certain extent, the housing problems we're facing is a result of policies of previous government. We don't have enough private housing, and HOS flats are not completed on time, and there aren't enough PRH. I understand that the current government is trying to catch up. But how can we expedite the process to catch up with the shortfall? Members have spoken a lot about the supply estimate. I'd like to talk about a number of factors, mentioning a number of organizations, the URA and the Housing Society. But there aren't any specific information as to whether how these bodies can help. It takes a long time for the projects to materialize, to find land, to build. Well, how can these bodies help? Say, for example, for the Type A estate under the Housing Society, URA developments. Are there any ways to enable these bodies to expedite the supply of housing? Say, for example, the Housing Society, they have encountered difficulties and there aren't there is no land. How can you help them?
How can we increase supply, allow PRH tenants to move up? Well, this touches upon subdivided units. Of course, we can alleviate the situation by increasing supply. But now we are aware that subdivided unit tenants, first of all, they are on the waiting list. They're not in PRH. They can't afford rent. That's why they have to live in inadequate housing. They want to live downtown. It's easier to go to work. They don't want to live out of the downtown area. And third, their income is insufficient. It's just above the threshold for PRH, and they are not yet qualified for the second tier to afford HOS. They can't afford an independent apartment in the downtown area, so therefore they need extra support. So even if we increase the PRH and so on, for this group of people who are just above the threshold, and I always use this example, a two-person family, they are at minimum wage, they work 12 hours a day, and they would exceed the income threshold. But they're not high flyers, they can't afford an independent unit, and they don't have savings to purchase their own apartment. So will the government assist this group? Are there any measures to help these people trapped in between? Well, two questions. The Housing Society and URA, what role can they play? The paper has touched upon this. Of course, we would like to hear more from society, specifically in the Long-Term Housing Strategy Subcommittee. We have Housing Society Chairman, and we also had a past chairman of the URA. So we would like these two bodies to increase supply and play a role, increase housing supply. But regarding PRH, the Housing Society has a small role to play. So the larger role would be played by the HA. So we would like to have some subsidized housing. Regarding rebuilding of old estates, whether it is HA or Housing Society, we face the same problem. That is how to find apartments or how to rebuild in the meantime. So we would like to rationalize the workflow. URA has been mentioned in the paper. The LTHS would like the URA to target low middle income families and provide housing for this group. Regarding subdivided unit tenants, these people don't qualify for PRH. Well, first of all, we would need to increase HOS. That would solve the long-term problem. It would stabilize property prices, rent, and so on. And they would like to live in downtown area, and even if they qualify for PRH, they would have to queue, and it would be very hard to guarantee that they could still live in the downtown area. Some waiting list applicants are in subdivided housing, but regarding the queue, we need to maintain fairness. So it is a complex problem. The Long-Term Housing Subcommittee proposed that low-income grassroots, they should be catered to through the PRH, but when they exceed the threshold, then HOS would be an important supply. So how do we build equitable housing ladder? That is something that we need to consider. Mr. Kwok-hing. We have always proposed the importance of HOS and PRH. So if you want to propose this public-private split of 60-40, it is still far short of what the Federation of Trade Unions have been calling for. There is still room for increasing supply and to meet our objective. Just now, the Secretary mentioned that you hope that the long-term housing strategy consultation can assist, or it can provide a housing ladder to help Hong Kong people own their own property. But this ladder, each step, if it's wider, then the next step would be harder. So do we just have to rely on public-private split? Well, we can actually have a further breakdown. For example, in PRH, aside from the Housing Authority, grassroots PRH, Housing Society can also play a bigger role. For example, in the past, they had Type B rental units. So could this be fine-tuned such that in the light of skyrocketing prices, there can be another ladder? And even for HOS, there's a big problem. That is a discount compared to market price to determine price of HOS. Well, but we all know private prices are crazy now. Prices are now even higher than 97. So is there a bubble? I think that is for us to consider. But if you want to set price according to this frothy price levels, even if you give a discount of 30-40%, it's still a crazy price. So if you want to assist people of limited income, then shouldn't you delink the price relationship between HOS and the private sector? Shouldn't the HOS be priced according to their income levels? It shouldn't be based on market prices. And regarding regulation of subdivided housing, subdivided units, I think the general consensus is that it should be regulated, even though the Secretary says that it's illegal and so on. But well, in the past we had squatters, and that had been scrapped, but now we have subdivided housing. Does it mean the problem is solved if we ignore it? No, I can tell you no. Then we need to deal with it. The subdivided unit owners, they are charging a higher level of rent. If the original rent was 10,000 and now they divide it into 4 units, they are now charging 20, 30, 40,000. It's illegal and they're making more money. So the Secretary, can't you do something more to protect the tenants of subdivided units? Even if they are inadequately housed, they shouldn't be facing a safety problem. Let me respond to two questions regarding the regulation of subdivided units. I need to clarify that regulation, as proposed in the paper, it's not referring to illegal subdivided units. No, we're talking about residential or composite use building where they can legally divide the units. The fire safety, health, and so on has to be regulated. Of course, in the last few weeks, we heard different views, and we'll continue listening. Mr. Kwok also talked about delinking HOS price from market prices. Well, if you look at HA, how they determine price for HOS, of course, they refer to market price, but the actual price, it also takes into account the income level of the applicants. There's a formula. For example, if they apply for a mortgage, how long it takes to pay off the mortgage. They also look at non-housing expenditure, and they will come up with an affordability figure and then provide a discount. Of course, the HOS tenant, if they sell their unit, they will have to pay a premium. But if they don't sell, it's for self-use purposes. They will never be troubled by the market price. So, well, no matter what, we will take into account the society's views and rationalize our approach. Just now Mr. Kwok mentioned the 60-40 ratio might not be sufficient. Our paper proposed 60-40. It's just a preliminary figure. We just want to highlight that public housing has to play a bigger role. Well, should it be 65-35? I'm aware there are different suggestions. So in the LTHS, there has been a long debate. Next, we have Mr. Fernando Chung. Thank you, Chairman. The Long-Term Housing Subcommittee, the Secretary says that each family should have appropriate and affordable housing. That is very important, and I believe most of us would support that. But what is adequate and affordable? The paper has not provided a definition. So the whole document it's a response to our needs for the next 10 years, but it's unfortunate that we don't have a definition. What do we mean by affordable and adequate housing? We need to have a definition in order to determine whether the goal is achievable. If the goal is talking about if the goal is about abstract concepts, then how are we going to accomplish that? We need to come up with a definition of appropriate housing. And I see you have not defined appropriate housing, or you have talked about inadequately housed households. Well, that is definitely inadequate. Subdivided unit, cage homes, temporary housing, rooftop structures, and so on. And so on. If you have defined what is inadequately housed households, you need to at least come up with a clear definition. And second, regarding affordable, let's assume PRH is affordable, but what is affordable private housing? If you look at the income mortgage ratio, it's more than 50%. That is, mortgage payments compared to income. The mortgage makes up more than 50% of the income. More than half of your monthly salary goes to the mortgage. That is not affordable. So what is affordable? Is there any global standard? 20% of income? Is that healthy? So that would give us some specific indicators. Otherwise, this is just empty talk, and you're now talking about a proposed supply target of 470,000 units in the coming decade. Now, even a 60-40 split, that we're talking about 280,000, and that would include HOS. So PRH, if 80% is public PRH in the 60-40 split, so we're talking about some 220,000 PRH in the coming 10 years. We now have more than 200,000 in the waiting list. So in 10 years' time, you can't house those on the list. So how can you provide adequate and affordable housing for each family in Hong Kong? So could you give a definition for the two concepts?
Adequate and affordable. Well, in the document you find paragraph 4.18 as to what is inadequate. We've also taken reference from similar housing documents in other countries, and there is no definition, no quantified definition of adequate housing. In any event, I think what Mr. Zhang said. We've heard the views that there should be a definite definition on adequate. But when it comes to affordable, well, different people have different interpretation. Currently, we think that HOS flats are affordable. Yes, it will be difficult for people to afford private housing now. That's why the administration rolled out demand-side management to address the problem. Some people said that even with the launching of these harsh measures, there is no dampening in the private property market. But in any event, given Hong Kong's situation and the fact that housing is an essential element in people's lives, the administration will provide adequate housing. When it comes to the definition, we have to look at different types. Say PRH or subsidized housing. We will give a we have to define it in accordance with that target group. When it comes to private housing, their living standard and how much they spend on housing. And perhaps we will give it more thought after we've heard from the public. Mr. Kwok-hing. The theme of the consultation document is building consensus, building homes. The government said that this is an important issue out of all important issues. If we can forge consensus on this important issue, I believe that it will be a great help to improving people's livelihood. This year is the 60th anniversary of the Housing Authority. The building of PRH units enables upward mobility, and all the measures have been effective. I ask for further clarifications. It says that it should be supply-led. You mentioned public housing accounting for a higher proportion. The Secretary mentioned 60-40 and said that it's not fixed. It may be 30-70, 70-30, 50-50 or anything. But you need to tell us whether the premise is that there will be more public housing than private housing. If that is the case, how can you ensure its effectiveness? That you will respond swiftly to changes in the coming 10 years. You mentioned an effective housing ladder to assist a younger generation to purchase flats. What do you mean by an effective housing ladder? Of course, there is a ladder for PRH. You are housed in PRH units. When your life improves, then you will buy an HOS flat, then you will buy in the private housing. So do you have a new idea about a housing ladder? Well, let me first focus on an effective housing ladder. What it means in the paper is that if it is, well, we hope that through PRH units we'll be able to help those low-income families to be housed, and once they've been housed in PRH, as their lives improve, they will move up to HOS. Next to the number of HOS flats and PRH flats available, of course, it depends on the demand we have assessed. And for HOS flats, we also take into account the secondary market. Drawing from the experience from the past 2 decades, for people who are living in PRH and HOS flats, they might move to the private market. We did not mention any fixed targets of purchased flats. And of course, people, when they have the means, they would like to purchase. The Singaporean experience shows that people buy a flat to provide security when they retire. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung. Well, the word adequate can be an academic discussion, but here we're talking about livelihood issues. So when it comes to adequate housing, people who are waiting for PRH units, these people are definitely living in inadequate housing. That's without a doubt. They earn very low income. How can they be housed in adequate housing? So I think you're referring to people who are on the waiting list. They are living in inadequate housing, and that should be given priority. The LTHS talked about the coming 10 years. I don't see as far ahead as you, Secretary. I only look at the 230,000 people on the waiting list. How can the LTHS address the housing need of these 230,000 people on the waiting list? You said that the LTHS has 2 goals. One, to maintain an average waiting time of 3 years for PRH units. The other is for non-elderly singleton. You will refine the QPS and by phases shorten the waiting time for those above the age of 35. About 110,000 of these applicants are singletons. So let's say there are 110,000. Every year, as you said, that you can provide 22,000 units. So how can you meet the target of maintaining 3 years? You use every means to make people give you back the PRH units, so several thousand a year. Still, you will not be able to meet the average waiting time of 3 years. I'm only talking about 2P or above. What about those 1P applicants? In a few years, they may get married and they will be 2P families. I'm not going to talk to you about the inaccuracies of your net increase. How do you address the problems of not being able to meet the waiting time? And as you said in your paper, not all singleton applicants are under 35. There may be some above 35. They are in their 40s, living in a subdivided flat, and they are single. Your vision sounds grand, but there's no use. Solve the problem of 230,000 households. Secretary. Well, when it comes to the LTHS, we're talking about long term. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to solve short-term problems. I fully understand what Mr. Leung is driving at. Well, there are two parts. Families or singleton, we're talking about 110,000 or so for non-elderly singleton. This more or less the same, and those under the age, for those non-elderly singleton, about 2/3 of them are under 35. And of course, we will give priority of those who are over 35. In the end, we have to look at the production rate of PRH units. In the coming 5 years, we're talking about 79,000. And of course, it's subject to whether the applicant is eligible. For non-elderly, they may not fit the bill. There are a lot of figures. I may not be able to give you the relevant figure. We have done some analysis on waiting time. Perhaps in the housing panel we'll be able to give you more information. What about the 3-year waiting time? As at June, we're talking about the average waiting time. Of course, there are some that have to wait for longer than 3 years and some shorter. Yes, there is an increase, but I'll give you more information afterwards. In the consultation paper, it's mentioned that, well, as to whether this goal will be more and more difficult to reach, but the steering committee thinks that we should just keep it in mind as a goal. Mr. Leung Kwok-hing, Confucius says that he will not talk about ghosts or the supernatural because you're still alive. You don't know what happens after you die. Well, do you know that in the next government, Secretary, you may be able to become the CS, the Chief Secretary. Leung Chi-chang supposed to support you, but still he can't do it because you're talking about too far ahead. My second point, I have an idea. CY Leung, said to Hong Kong people that he's taken 90 people to go to Chongqing. There is a new development area, the same size as Hong Kong. Just transport all of us here over there to Chongqing. Is he going to do that? That is what C.Y. Leung is like. He will pay lip service. He will say it first. He just give everything to committees, and people just there to talk shop without doing anything substantial. You don't need land. Just stand on the spot. You're standing in that summit tomorrow to say that you revive rent control. Then you will have done something. Will you do it? You won't. And it's something simple. Instead, you're talking about failure to find land. We have to come up with something. How much disposed sites do you have? You can't give us the figure. You're just pulling wool over our eyes. The CY is not doing what he said in the manifesto, but instead he's doing things that was not in the manifesto. It's kind of like public relations, liaising with the mainland. He acts like he's the usher in a restaurant, a receptionist in a restaurant when he meets with mainland officials that are of a lower rank. I'm asking him to tell his boss that there are only words and no action. He says he said a lot of things, but nothing's done.
And then we have the double stamp duty, extra stamp duty. And you say that if we don't have stamp duty, the prices will skyrocket even more. It's like my friend who went to see a clinic because of high fever, and I asked the doctor, why is the temperature 39.5? And the doctor said if I didn't give him medication, the patient would have a fever of more than 40 degrees. Well, you should have told me earlier. I wouldn't take you to this clinic. You're not trying to alleviate the rich-poor divide. You are now trying to settle you're trying to mediate the differences between rich mainlanders and the rich Hong Kong people. So what policy do you have on hand? What are you going to do? You need to explain the long-term housing strategy. Why isn't it making reference with Singapore? Why isn't it learning from Singapore? If that should be your long-term strategy. Who has a smaller land area, Singapore or Hong Kong? Is Singapore connected to Malaysia? Have you finished your question? Oh, I think it's just ludicrous. You're saying that I can't handle your fever. You're at 39 degrees now. Your fever hasn't come down, and you're saying that if I didn't give you this medication, you might have 40 odd degrees. Well, if you were a lawyer, can you tell your client that well, if it wasn't for me, you would have been given the death sentence. Bo Xilai is now given a life sentence, and you're just threatening Hong Kong people. Chairman, all he's doing is visiting the mainland. How many party secretaries can he meet? Zhang Zhejiang has just been nominated in Chongqing, and C.Y. Leung is entertaining him. And Mr. Zhong Xugan, I have 4 questions. The LTHS, I think it's too conservative. The Secretariat has some information that they have 3 years of analysis in 87, 98, and 2003. In 87, we had population size of 5.6 million. In 98, we have 6.5 million population and a target of 85,000. And now, in 2013, you want to have a supply of 470,000. And people are saying that in your waiting list there's a queue of 200,000. This will only grow. The waiting list will only grow. So how can you make up the shortfall? The shortfall might get even bigger and bigger. So when you implement the long-term housing strategy, are you going to implement a conservative policy? If you run into obstacles such as land supply, shouldn't you expend more effort? And we should be aware of these problems. Second, in terms of PRH, the well-off tenant policy, shouldn't that be reviewed? The well-off tenants have told their children to deregister, and you have actually they will stay in PRH forever. So you're not alleviating the problem. So you are actually adding to the queue. So you really do need to review the well-off tenant policy, such that we don't have the younger generation being deregistered from the PRH. So those who have been defined as well-off tenants, they should have priority in purchasing a green form HOS. They will purchase it reluctantly if they can afford it. If you provide some incentives, they will purchase it. And then that could release some extra PRH and reduce the waiting time. Third, young people, if there is a need, if they can take care of parents, they can be included. Well, have you considered intergenerations? Let's say there's a grandchild. They cannot live separately. So could the grandchild live with the PRH tenant? That is just another way to reduce the waiting time. And lastly, regarding subdivided units and licensing, just now the Secretary said you want to issue licenses to qualified units. Well, if they qualify, then you don't need this regulation. Just let the market handle it. You don't need that, but you want to create more bureaucracy, more legislation, then it's very if they're not qualified, then you should just ban them, and there shouldn't be any extra licensing. It's just harassment. Well, thank you, Chairman. Mr. Zhong talked about well-off tenant policy and so on. And I'm not trying to defend these policies. Well, regarding the well-off tenant policy, the document has touched upon this. Some people want to tighten the policy. Some people want to relax it. I'll put forward both positions. And we'd just like to hear more from society. It's the same for crowded tenants and so on. Well, well-off tenant is a controversial topic. In the LTHS, some people call for relaxation, some people want to tighten it, but during consultation we want to hear more. The figures, are they conservative? Well, I won't call it aggressive or conservative. We don't want to overestimate or underestimate. We want to look at the coming decade and the growth in number of households, and this is based on historical data. So will the economy change? Will employment conditions change? Will that affect the growth of households? This has to be reviewed regularly. But we won't distort the figures because of particular reasons. Regarding 98 and how it's different from now, well, I will not comment on why a certain policy was promulgated in 98, but I'll say what we are using now is reasonable. Mr. James Toh, those who are not eligible for PRH, That will be my focus. Or to further narrow it down, I'd like to look at those eligible for HOS. So, in paragraph 3 of the executive summary, says that the steering committee should play a more aggressive role. It should have more HOS supply, and it suggests an increase, but it doesn't say how much should be, what the increment should be. And if you recall, I've always called for some indicators. In your Roman numeral 4, you have a response. In Roman numeral 4, paragraph 3, you're saying, the chairman says, that is yourself are saying, we're trying to target low middle income family and other subsidized households to help them afford housing. But then you change tack and say, we agree that we want to stabilize the society and so on. So this is what I'd like to focus on. If the steering committee says increase, but you don't have hard quotas, then first of all, do you have soft quotas? Well, what are the soft quotas then? Do you have any indicators at all? Or just have some increase in PRH to help those who don't qualify for PRH? So you're saying just wait. You can wait 10, 20, 30, 40 years. That's your problem. There's no quota or target to aim for. Second, if you, when I asked the secretary, when I asked for hard quotas or hard figures, people who might qualify or might not qualify for HOS, and they can draw lots for 7 times. I think that's what you mean by a hard quota, and then they have to pay a mortgage over 20 years, and they will retire by the time the mortgage is paid down. Or so what do you mean by these? It means that they will have to continue waiting for HOS. So it's like winning the lottery. Or you die young and you don't need to queue in this, or you live in a subdivided unit. In PRH, there are some indicators, but there are no indicators for HOS. And they continue to live in inadequate households, inadequate housing, where it consumes a large part of their income. So will all these people get housing in 7 years? How about half? How about a third? At least, if you build that many HOS, then after 7 draws of the lot, they will have a chance at HOS. But now, without any indicators, it seems that you're not doing your job. Mr. James Ho had presented this idea in previous meetings. When we, in '98, the LTHS had made reference to public-private, and we wanted a housing ratio of 70%. That's not what we were referring to. Regarding HOS, is there a quota in the document? In the LTHS document, it does not mention and how it will be divided, how the 60% of public housing should be divided. But of course, we need to hear from society to see if there should be a specific ratio or figure. Regarding people who have not drawn a successful lot in HOS for years, whether we can have a mechanism, whether there's light at the end of the tunnel, we can look at that. Next, Mr. Wong Yongman. Thank you, Chairman. Reading the consultation document, the theme is building consensus, building homes. Yes, this is our aspiration, but it seems like it's just talk. And in the introduction, in the chairman's forward, Hong Kong has more than 1.7 million poor. When Du Fu wrote this poem, his hut was blown down. He wrote, and that's where the quotation comes from. He wrote a poem when his hut was blown down. So how do we respond?
I think it's too early for CY Leung to dream. We're talking about 10 years. 10 years later, will you still be alive? I believe that you have the heart to do it. Then become the chief executive. I don't think the CY Leung, the 689, will be the next chief executive. So there is no continuity of the policy, but we do need continuity. What we see is that housing occupies the top of the list. This is the most important issue of all. It's very important. It affects a lot of people. We have poverty in Hong Kong, housing problems for the elderly, welfare issues for the elderly. It's not just about housing. Well, a long time ago, Chinese people have already started said that when there is land, there is a way out. So if you can resolve land issue, then you will be able to resolve housing. Then you will win over the people and society will become stable. So you cannot just go through the motions. You cannot just pay lip service. You cannot just talk a lot of hot air. You have to show us your determination. I spent a long time reading through it, and I have written a number of summaries. Well, that's how I feel. Other members have touched on other issues, and I'd like to tell the Secretary that you are an academic, you are a professor, you need to have determination. We have expectations of you. How can you ensure that everyone is housed? But you cited a poem in the Tang Dynasty, but the poet talks about scholars. That in relation to the fact that when there is a strong gust of wind, these scholars have lost the roof to their home. That's why he expressed a wish that everyone will be housed and everyone will be happy and they will have a stable life so that they will be content. Can you provide the same? I have a lot of views, say for example about the licensing system of subdivided flats. There'll be a lot of problems, and I have some views to share with you later. But in general, if you do not put this issue on the top of the list, and that everyone involved will persevere and have determination, unlike what this chief executive is doing, he's just talking. At the beginning, some people do believe in him, like Ho Hei-wa. They wanted him to build more PRH to shorten the waiting time and exercise discretion for them to house those in need. And also to refine the QPS. Resolve everything where it's possible. And I think you need to build more PRH units. The basic solution is to build more flats, build more PRH units. After reading this consultation document, we have to hope that the Secretary will live long so that he will be the next Bureau Secretary so that the policy can be continued. So you need to show us your determination. Otherwise, nothing will come out of it. Can I have 2 minutes to respond? Can it be shorter than that? Secretary. I am not going to go into details about poems. He talks about building more PRH units to resolve the problem. I can say to Mr. Wong that I am very concerned about housing problems, and I do hope that I will tackle all difficulties. We're talking about housing and adequate housing. And actually, no matter who is the secretary will continue to address housing problems. And I do think that there is a determination, and the determination can be shown by the public. Anyone else in the first round? If not, we have 2 members in the second round. Well, 3. I would like to give my 5 minutes to members in the second round. First, the current government has shown determination to address housing problems. I really appreciate that. In the past 7 or 8 years in the housing panel of the LegCo, we've been asking the administration to conduct a review, which was turned down. They kept saying that there will be an average waiting time of 3 years. They refused to review the housing policy, nor did they agree to reformulate a long-term housing strategy. When this government has taken office, they have encountered a lot of difficulties. Yet, they are determined to take this up. They engage people from different sectors to conduct a review. Now we have this consultation document. This is the right way forward. But the most important thing is to implement it. As the chairman said in his foreword, after the public consultation, the government has to formulate policies. And that is very important. My first question to the secretary. Well, he said that he would do his best to get it done in the first quarter of next year. I hope he'll be able to do that. When the administration decides in the first quarter of next year, that means they only have about 3 years left in the current term. So there is little time left. How can you show Hong Kong people that you are determined to resolve the pressing housing problems in Hong Kong? We all understand. Buildings don't grow like mushrooms. And you can't even build a block in 1 year. It takes time. I hope that when the report is available next year, there will indeed be consensus built and homes built. And I'd like to express my views on some specific points in the document. You may not have time to elaborate, but I'd like to raise these issues to draw the attention of the administration to it. First, subdivided flats, partition flats, the licensing regime. I don't think it's feasible. I object to it because you will see the drawbacks before you benefit, and this is not an appropriate approach. Secondly, the administration should look at the TPS again, the tenant purchase scheme again. The administration rejected us a number of times. I do think that, of course, there are shortcomings of the TPS, and at the same time, it has its benefits. And they should not just adamantly say that they are not going to consider it. People who are living in PRH, when their living standard improves, they should be given the chance to purchase their flats. For the home starter loan, the administration said outright that they will not consider it. I think the home starter loan scheme helps people who are unable to come up with a down payment to buy a flat. I asked the administration to consider it. Number 3, rent control. Again, the administration rejected the idea, or they say they inclined not to do it. I think rent control is worth considering. Of course, you should not just copy and paste what was done before. There were shortcomings. Would you find something that worked, some kind of compromise? Secretary, you are also responsible for transport. The FTU has been saying that it's important to have a monthly pass for transportation. People are reluctant to move to a remote area because of high transportation cost. If there is an affordable monthly pass, people may be willing to live a little bit far away, even though they have to spend longer time traveling, and in a way it helps the housing problem. Well, my time's used up and I don't need an answer from the administration. There are 4 members in the second round. Well, I have to allot time to them, and I need 2 minutes to discuss other issues. 3 minutes each, no more than that. Mr. Kwok-hing. We all agree that there should be more units built. Well, perhaps if you run for the chief executive, like Raymond Wong, you will get a lot of votes. I want to say that the LTHS is addressing housing problems accumulated over the years. But does it complement population policy? Has the Population Policy Steering Committee given you any information to consider? We have an aging population. We have to address housing problems for the elderly. Families should be encouraged to give birth, but there is no such information in this consultation document. Can you give them more options, a kind of incentive? I'm not talking about affecting their freedom, just to give them more choices. I very often hear that I find it difficult to pay the mortgage. So I don't want to have children to see them experiencing this difficulty. They pay for 20 to 30 years for just one flat. If assistance is given to this group of people, then it will help. It will also address the problem of an aging population. Secretary. Well, there is a committee led by the Chief Secretary when it comes to population policy. I agree with Mr. Kwok. Yes, housing problems affect poverty and affects an individual's choice in his planning. Say, for example, starting a family and having children. What we would like to see is that every family will be able to afford adequate housing. Mr. Fernando Zhang. I asked 2 questions about adequate housing and affordable. The Secretary said that he would consider how to define them, especially when it comes to affordable housing in the private market. There should be a clear definition in your consultation report. Once there is a definition, then we can measure to find out when the goals will be achieved.
I had done some calculations, 470,000 over 10 years, but the PRH is only 220,000. If it's not 220,000, please correct me. If it is 220,000, and we now have 230,000 applicants on the waiting list, so how can you say that this can respond to the needs in the coming decade? After a decade, it's not even enough to satisfy the current waiting list. So, Leung Yizhong had asked a similar question. He said was referring to 3 years. We have 110,000 households and so on. You can't even meet the needs of the other singletons. Well, in the current PRH waiting list, non-elderly singletons, they are not in the 3-year waiting indicator pledge. And then we have the younger tenants. Their mobility might change, whether they need PRH. So it's very hard to come up with a figure. But the 220,000 you mentioned, this is the way I see it. If you have 470,000 over 10 years, if it's a split over 60-40 ratio, it might be 280,000 and 180,000. But if you look at PRH, it's not just newly built units. There might be resumed units and so on. And we might have a figure of some 7,000 per year. So in the 280,000, what is the ratio between tenant purchase scheme and PRH? Which is now we heard we should have some new quotas for HOS and so on. Well, the 7,000 that you resume, you can follow up in future consultation venues. The long-term housing goal, well, all my colleagues say it's insufficient, but now, even if you are proceeding ahead with a target of 470,000 units, there's still a lot of obstacles. We now have plot ratios of 6.5 to 8. It's very dense units. So I'd like to know, you are resuming land like crazy. And the people that relocate there will be living in very poor conditions. I've heard a new saying that you have to change household figures from 5 to 7. So living conditions will now deteriorate under your new thinking. So in your whole building process, this housing has to be comfortable, and you shouldn't affect the existing indigenous population. You have not dealt with this in your consultation paper. So will the tenants really have a comfortable living environment? In the LTHS document, we're not just building housing, but your plot ratio is 8. The density, on whatever level it is at, they have to be bound by planning restrictions. We're not trying to relax all standards, but no matter what, the density and the need for housing, we have to strike a balance between the two, because there is a significant lag in supply. So that's why we call the document a building consensus, because we are trying to strike balances. We want to accelerate building speed, and we also have to look at the construction industry, how fast it can build. So overall, society feels that we need more supply. Leung Yu-zhong, Wang Yokman mentioned that we need a bigger supply. So how do we achieve this? So we need a higher density, or in certain districts the population figures have to go up. But we would still like to strike a balance with transport, traffic, environment. We don't want to relax any planning standards. Mr. Leung, go home. Wang Yokman quoted the poet Du Fu. So that is exactly your housing policy. The subdivided units won't change, no come rain or hail. So you now have a very you have a stubborn subdivided unit policy. We also have a lack of mobility in society, as Mr. Kwok-hing said. If you want to reinstate the TPS scheme, then you can relax the area per tenant requirement. The whole policy is breaking down. The question is, let me point out to you first, you are not doing you're not implementing rent control, so speculators can transfer the costs. Second question, land. We have so many real estate developers that are accumulating farmland. So we should resume the land if it's not used for agricultural purposes. So we now have people holding on to farmland and using it as open area storage. So they should be given a year. They don't need to donate the land. We can just resume it. Will you do that? I'm offering you a suggestion. Will you do that? I'm running for CE next term. That will be my manifesto. If you resign from your job, I'll enlist you in my camp. Have you finished your question? Are you going to resume rent control? All the land that was acquired through fraud they should be resumed in a year. It should be a lottery for small real estate developers to build really cheap housing for Hong Kong people, to supplement the insufficient HOS and PRH. And then it can have a 80-20 split. 80% of Hong Kong people can live in subsidized housing. That will be my manifesto. You quit your job, I'll enlist you in my camp. Do you need to respond? In our consultation period, we'll listen to all the opinions. Okay. Well, time is almost up, and thank you, Secretary and officials attending our meeting. I'd like now to gauge your views according to House Committee Section 336C. The subcommittee has to complete its work within 12 months. So starting from our commencement date, some 17th of December, we have to call it a day. But the long-term housing, this was only submitted at the beginning of the year. So I suggest that we extend our working period where we monitor the LTHS subcommittee conclude its work. That is your opinion. I'm referring to our work procedures. Do we agree in extending the subcommittee? Then I'll report to the House Committee and explain. Okay, meeting adjourned, Secretary. Let's coordinate our efforts. Thank you very much.